I heard that the author of this book really loves synth pop, so I'm wearing my New Order shirt in honor of that because it only felt appropriate. Hey guys, it's Anna. Welcome back to another video on my channel. Today I'm going to be giving you guys a spoiler-free review for White Stag by Barbieri. I'm very excited about this video because I was lucky enough to be part of the book tour, blog tour for this book release, and I've never been part of a blog tour, so I'm very excited about that, and I'm very glad that the first time that I've ever been able to do so was with a book that I ended up enjoying so much. I ended up giving this book a 3.75 out of 5 stars. I'm pretty sure that this is going to inevitably be a book that I end up bumping up to maybe a 4 stars once I start thinking less critically about it and more entertainment-wise about it. If you remember from last year, that's kind of the same thing I did with Caraval. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the review. Like I said, it is spoiler-free, so if you have not read this book, no worries. I'm not going to be spoiling anything for you. I do want to note that this book has trigger warnings for rape and body mutilation, and also just a lot of gore. So with all that being said, let's jump right into my review. A good overview of this novel without going to spoiler territory would be that it follows this girl named Janeka who, as a child, her village was raided and burned down by goblins, and ever since then, for the past 100 years, she has served as a thrall to a goblin named Soren. In the goblin world, the permafrost as they call it, anytime that the Earl King, who is the ruler of the goblins, dies, a new Earl King has to hunt this white stag, and whoever kills the stag becomes the new king. So that is kind of the catalyst for this story. You follow Janeka being a human stuck in this goblin world and the journey of who becomes the next goblin lord. But really, a lot more happens. Obviously, that's how things work. If you saw my most recent review I did on my channel, which I believe was my Illuminae review, then you will know that I have a specific way that I do reviews. I take a bunch of notes while reading, and then afterward I look at my notes and figure out the pros and the cons, and I go through them one by one and kind of discuss them. So I'm going to be doing the same thing with this review for White Stag. I'm going to begin with a pro, and then I'm going to go to a con, and then back and forth. So first, I'm going to start with a pro. That pro being more about writing style, and that is the fact that the action in this novel was so well written. This is one of the first times in a long time that I've read a novel and been more excited about action scenes than dialogue scenes, because in my opinion, I felt that the action scenes were more well written than the dialogue, which I will get a little bit more into in just a second. But the action was glorious. I loved every single action scene that I read. What made the action scenes so great is that they were fast-paced, which I feel like is a must-have when writing an action sort of scene. But not only were they fast-paced, but they didn't spare any of the details. You got every single bit of gory goodness that I think really works well with action-packed fantasy novels, and I wish we had more of. This novel centers around goblins. Goblins are notoriously very gory and very brutal creatures, so I think that helped the case a lot. But in all honesty, the most gory character of them all was the main character, who is a human. That was interesting. It also plays into a plot point kind of detail that I'm going to get into later that I really enjoyed. Another reason that I loved the action so much in this novel was because it felt like you could watch it in your head. It honestly felt like I was reading the stage directions for a movie or something because of how fluid all of the action sequences were, and I really love that about it. The action porn basically in this novel was one of my favorite aspects about it. This moves me into my first con of the novel, which is that some of the dialogue was a little bit exposition-y. This was more towards the beginning than anywhere else in the novel. It kind of tailored off at the end, so you didn't really have to worry about it. But at the very beginning, there were some dialogue bits that seemed a little clogged, just because of how much exposition was kind of shoved in there. In fact, I have an example. Excuse the laptop glare of my glasses, but the example that I have says, quote, "You know what the best thing about being a goblin is? Not being able to create due to the power that the permafrost gives us isn't the only thing." And then it goes on to say the rest of the quote, but that specific bit is what I want to talk about. So like I said earlier, the permafrost is the name of the land that they live in, and if you know much about goblins, you know that they are destroyers of everything. And in this novel, it talks a lot about how the goblins will raid human villages and then take humans in as thralls, because humans are really good at creating things and goblins cannot create anything. And so that's kind of what this quote is talking about. But at the time of that being said in the novel, it had already been established, so I don't understand why that was thrown in there. Like, it kind of just clogged up the dialogue of what Soren was saying. Also, another thing about this dialogue is that he's saying it to a character that already knows. He's saying it to Janeka, who is the main character, and she already knows that goblins can't create anything. That was just an example of something that happened a couple times toward the beginning of the novel. But like I said, as the novel went on, there was less and less of that. So the next pro I'm going to mention is overall that the characters were so interesting. interesting and very diverse. If you know me, I'm a very character-driven person. I of course want to read a novel that has both an interesting plotline and an interesting cast of characters, but even if a novel's plotline is lacking, I will still enjoy it if I like the characters, and this novel did that. I love the characters in this novel. Favorite was Soren for sure, who is the goblin who is kind of like in charge of Jeneka, but also not really. She is technically his thrall, so you kind of meet him through that lens, but he evolves as a character, which I really enjoyed. This is a little bit of a side tangent, but I did mention it briefly earlier. Soren is a goblin and Jeneka is a human, and one of the overarching kind of like minor plot lines within the novel is the idea of what it means to be human versus goblin. There are a lot of hard differences that are drawn between the two species in the novel, which is understandable, and there's a lot of discussion on what it means to be a monster. This is a topic of dialogue that comes up quite a lot, which I actually really did enjoy. I thought that was a good use of calling back to like previous conversations in the novel. My favorite dynamic between Soren and Jeneka though is the fact that they exhibit the opposite one's features quite a lot. So at the beginning of the novel, Jeneka is speaking to Soren and using sarcasm, and by the end of the novel, he's the one who's using sarcasm all the time because he's picked up on it. I actually have a note in my journal that says, quote, "All goblin stories revolve around goblins becoming infatuated with humans because they want to be like them," which is interesting because Jeneka throughout the whole novel does not want to be like the goblins, but you see goblins constantly being either disgusted or fascinated with Jeneka and how human she is, and the ones that are fascinated with her, like Soren, tend to pick up on like human traits, so I thought that was really interesting. Some of my favorite bits of dialogue in the novel come from Soren trying to relate to Jeneka on a human level to make her feel more comfortable in her surroundings, which is another interesting like blurring of the line that I found in the novel and really liked. Next, I'm going to talk about another con, and this is actually the last con that I have written down, and that is the main conflict with the main antagonist, Lydian, who is another goblin. Doesn't really seem like as much of a pressing matter as I feel like it was intended to or should have been. So basically Lydian is, in a non-spoiler way of telling you, trying to kill the white stag just like all the other goblins are, but he's a genuinely bad goblin, so no one wants him to become Earl King. Lydian also used to be Jeneka's master. I hate saying that, but like that's the term in the novel because she was his thrall, he was her master, that kind of thing. So there is a conflict between Jeneka and Lydian is also Soren's uncle. So there's like this huge all-encompassing plot line about like how bad Lydian is, but out of all like the strings of plot lines that are in this novel, Lydian's conflict seems to be like the least important, and I think that it was supposed to be the most important, or at least like very important, but for me I honestly could not care less about it. Not to say that I didn't enjoy it. I did enjoy the action scenes, especially that we got with Lydian, but for the most part it felt more like the conflict in this novel was Jeneka and her humanity and how she feels like she's losing it, or how she doesn't want to die because that is like a very human fear to have. Goblins don't fear death, and Jeneka is like clinging to this fear of death because it is like one of the last human bits that she has after spending 100 years in the permafrost. So I felt like that was more of the conflict as opposed to the whole Lydian bit. So yeah, I felt like the main plot line, or the main conflict rather, was not as fleshed out as it could have been. And kind of going off of that, I do have another point that I want to make that's kind of like a sub point. There's a plot twist that is kind of brought up, and like other plot twists that I usually have problems with, it didn't seem warranted, or earned rather. That's my favorite way of explaining it. In the case of this novel, it is kind of like a life-altering thing for Jeneka, but the way it is presented doesn't really seem like the best way. In my opinion, it could have been executed a little bit better. So the plot twist itself is very interesting, and I liked the way it drove the story forward, but the lead up to it was really frustrating. This is definitely one of those novels where it gets better as you continue reading, and this is just an example of that. Like the plot twists toward the end are very, very interesting and warranted and earned. Lastly, I want to end on a positive note, so I have another pro. I love, if you did not know, Norse mythology or anything about Nordic folklore, and this novel has a lot of really interesting creatures in it. You get to see Skadi. There's reference to Odin. There are lindworms in this, which I had never read about, and I actually like Googled and did some research on my own, and they're super interesting. And there are also Draugr in this, which I've never seen outside of Skyrim. Like, I know that they are a Nordic thing, like they don't just exist within Skyrim, but me being the big Skyrim nerd that I am, freaking out a little bit at Draugr being mentioned. I think that my slight interest in Norse mythology really stemmed from Neil Gaiman, so reading about this in this novel like gave me a lot of feels about my favorite author, so I really enjoyed that part of it too. Those are all of the specific points that I have written down. Overall, I really enjoyed this novel. The more I think about it, the more I realize that I did truly enjoy it and have fun reading it. And like I said said at the beginning, my current status rating for it is 3.75, but it will probably get bumped up to a 4. The description in this novel was beautiful, especially the action description. I'm very excited to see where Janeka and Soren go from here. I do believe there is a sequel. On Goodreads, it looks like this is number 1 of a series, so I'm excited to see where it goes. This book came out January 8th, so 2 days ago. On the day that you are watching this. I would highly recommend checking it out if you are interested in goblins or anything with a good action storyline. Thank you guys for watching this video. I'm sure it was way more rambly and way more scatterbrained than I intended it to be. If you guys enjoyed this review, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you've read White Stag or you are planning to, let me know in the comments down below. That is it for today's video, and I will see you next time I post another one. Bye.